be sure to follow me on Instagram. There you can hang out with me and talk to me directly. You know, I almost completely forgot about Chaos War. If I'm being honest with you guys, I almost completely and totally forgot about this story. I was so looking forward to the conclusion of House and Powers of X. I didn't even think about it. I was just like, yeah, man, like X-Men stuff, cool. All right, moving on. And then I was looking and I was like, because I usually do a weekly recap, kind of going through the videos that I've done to make sure I don't really have any loose ends. And I was like, we never finished Chaos War. So Chaos War, the conclusion. Basically, Hercules becomes like the most powerful god ever. It's interesting, right? Because in the last video, we had like basically the Chaos King, Mikabashi, essentially just kind of like crushing the entirety of the godly pantheon, right? Like basically everyone that the Chaos King has faced off against, he's either ensnared or destroyed, right? And when I say ensnared, I mean brought them under his control so that they become his servants. And this includes like the entire multiverse, right? It's one of the things Amadeus Cho says is that like the Chaos King has basically removed or consumed 98% of the multiverse. So it's not just the main Marvel universe, right? Now here's one of the questions people are going to ask. Where's the living tribunal? If a single being comes into into this story, like basically comes out of his dimension and starts just like annihilating the entirety of the multiverse and consumes 98% of it, then where's the living tribunal? Where's the tribunal? Like we have no idea what the living tribunal is doing, but it's not here. And that's the reason why, is because if the tribunal showed up in this story, I mean, you have to imagine the Chaos King is an aspect of the cosmic entity Oblivion, right? And if you go and you look at the cosmic order in terms of how Marvel's depicted it over the years, like Oblivion is essentially equal to eternity. And if that's the case, then Oblivion itself is weaker than the living tribunal, in which case the Chaos King would be weaker than the living tribunal. So the tribunal would show up in the conflict like that, and it would basically be over in the blink of an eye. And so you couldn't tell a story off of that, right? Especially if it involves a character like Hercules. And so that's why the tribunal's not here, is because the story needs to be told, and that story couldn't be told if the living tribunal showed up. So what this does is it basically picks up with Athena meeting with the Chaos King. Now, we ended the last video on that, and in fact, it was just like a massive, underwhelming cliffhanger, and you'd be right if you were just like, that like the ending of that video sucks. It does, because the ending of that story sucks, because Chaos War is okay, but it's not the greatest story ever. But the cool thing about this is that Athena, as one of the Greek gods, it kind of looked down on humanity and looked at the direction the world was going in, right? And was basically like, so the world kind of sucks now, and like it's corrupt and it's screwed up. So what we need to do is basically annihilate everything and start anew. And that's why she allied herself with the Chaos King, because pretty much everything that had unfolded the way that it had been done by virtue of Athena herself, right? It's kind of like the guiding hand of the Chaos King, because the Chaos King is a force of nature, is really what he is, right? I mean, he's an aspect of Oblivion, which means he's just an idea. He's a concept that's out there, right? It's like a hurricane, right? A hurricane just moves in a particular direction, and whatever happens to be in its path is what gets consumed or destroyed or what have you. The question is, what if you could guide that hurricane towards particular destinations? That's kind of what Athena did. She guided this sort of hurricane of the Chaos King and said, go here, and then go there, and then take those guys out and those guys out, and so on and so forth, which really kind of gives us a pretty good understanding of her role within Marvel, right? Because she's the goddess of wisdom in Greek mythology. And so because of that, she had basically guided his hand, and she knew what was going to happen here. She knew that at the end of all this, you know, when her role was done, when she was no longer needed by the Chaos King, that he would destroy her. But notice this, her response to this is yes, like given your ability to go through and inflict all this destruction and to do everything you want to do and return all of reality back to a primordial void, that eventually life will reform again. This primordial void will basically begin to sort of coalesce, so on and so forth. Energy will basically erupt and all of existence will come back into play again. And then when that happens, life will begin anew and it'll have the chance to do it again, quote unquote, the right time, right? So Athena's ideology here is I, alongside everybody else, will die and be reborn. You, however, will remain in the primordial void, or whatever happens to you, whatever the case is. But it's this kind of idea that she's willing to sacrifice her life for what she believes to be a greater cause. And it's kind of interesting here because in response to that, the Chaos King basically seizes control of her and forces her to become his servant, because up to this point, that was never the case. She worked with him willingly. So what this does is it basically picks up with Hercules meeting with essentially what's left of the primordial gods that exist in you know, throughout the Marvel universe, or at least the Marvel multiverse, to be honest, if you're accounting other dimensions and so on and so forth, those survivors who have fled to this location. And what's going on here is really just kind of like a moment of respite, right? It's a chance to say goodbye. All these gods here have basically just been over and kissed their backsides goodbye. And that's really where things are at the moment, because you're talking about a singular being who's gone throughout the entirety of the multiverse, eradicated 98% of it, and those who he didn't kill, he basically bent to his whim. There really seems to be no way to win here. And in fact, like Galactus is one of the only cosmic entities left. Now, this is one of the things you also kind of have to bear in mind here, is is the nature of the cosmic entities, right? Because people would ask the question, well, what about entities like infinity, or what about entities like eon, or something like that? So cosmic entities really kind of exist in like two forms, right? You have their real form, for lack of a better word, and then you have the form that you see, right? So like when eternity shows up or something like that, that's the form that you see. Their real form is that they don't really have a physical form, right? They're an ideology, right? So it's like, show me the physical form of the thought in your head that says, I need to go to the grocery store. It's an abstract concept. They go to anthropomorpho in the dimension of manifestations when they want to get a true form, but by and large, they're just an ideology. If eternity in a particular universe represents everything that makes up that universe, and then that universe ceases to be, then so would that version of eternity, right? Infinity, all those different iterations. Characters like Galactus are a little different because he doesn't really represent an ideology. He does to a degree, but he is actually a being, right? I mean, he does have like an energy physical form. He doesn't go somewhere and get a form. He actually has, it's basically like a mass of energy and like basically this kind of suit that travels around and consumes worlds and different things like that. But it gets kind of interesting. It gets kind of wonky when you get to the nature of cosmic entities and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's the answer why you don't really see the cosmic entities here, is you're not going to see them from a different universe because their universe has been wiped out and they cease to exist. Now, as for Hercules being here and basically talking to these various, gods who are here, almost immediately after he arrives, he's attacked by Athena. And the funny thing about this is that Athena trying to take him out at the same time that like the negative zone is basically invading the entirety of the universe, all of whom are essentially swearing fealty in some form or fashion to Chaos King. And so it's really just kind of like everything sort of coming to an end, everything sort of winding down. Is that Athena's ideology when she is initially set loose a circumstance that would have Amadeus Cho be the one who would save the multiverse, instead of Amadeus Cho going to this pocket bubble that Hera had basically created, this kind of pocket universe that existed outside of the entirety of the multiverse, is that it was designed to keep Hercules safe, right? Because Athena knew what was going to come. She's like, these are all the things that I'm planning. These are all the things that I'm working on. I wanted to keep Hercules alive, but then it was kind of a screwed up scenario when Amadeus Cho, having, free will and doing what it is that he can, ultimately went and brought Hercules back. That was not supposed to happen. And so that's why things are kind of running awry a little bit at the moment, is because things, as far as Athena's plans go, they were supposed to go off without a hitch. And the result is that for the most part, Hercules is kind of an idiot. And so even though he's doing the right thing and he's trying to save the world, he's kind of blundering his way through it and sort of screwing things up at the same time. But the big moment with all of this stuff, the really huge moment here, is kind of this revelation of Gaia. Now, when it comes to the characters in Marvel Comics, if you go back and you read the old stories from Marvel, right? Like the old, really like the old Thor stories by Walt Simonson, the old Avengers stories by Roy Thomas, what you got here was this kind of explanation of how the universe and the gods tie into it, right? The funny thing is that if you go and you read Walt Simonson's Thor, you get one explanation about how everything came into existence. And even if you go read Tales of Asgard by Jack Kirby, you get a different explanation. If you read some of the Avengers stories that deal with the origins of the universe by Roy Thomas, you get one explanation, right? So different stories all sort of iterate it in different ways. This is, despite the fact that Greg Pak is pitching this to us as an absolute, it is only really one of multiple iterations of how all things came into existence, right? So kind of take this with a grain of salt here. But what Gaia says is that she's basically the mother of all gods in existence. Initially, Gaia existed before there ever was a universe, right? She was kind of a sister or a companion of sorts to Oblivion, but that's not explicitly stated, so I wouldn't run with that. But the idea was that when the universe came into existence, which is to say this space that all the planets and solar systems would occupy, it was Gaia who basically gave birth to it all. And again, it's just one of many interpretations of the origin of the universe. None of these are an absolute, right? There is no absolute explanation on the origin of the universe. But the big thing here is that because of the nature of the story and the way it's being told, if Gaia is the mother of all gods, then it means that essentially she can amp up the powers of Hercules. And where the earth itself is quite literally being torn apart by Chaos King himself, kind of siphoning off all these energies and so on and so forth, ultimately what ends up happening is Gaia basically boosts up the power of Hercules and then says, now you are the god of gods, which means you have to go forward accordingly. And it's kind of a funny thing because what she says here is the human side of you will want to save everyone. The human side of you will want to say everybody needs to be saved, everybody needs to be alive, but the reality is you can't save everyone. Mourn those you lose, but move forward accordingly. And it's kind of interesting because it's something that Hercules really initially seems to disagree with, but the way that Greg Pak does it, it's almost sort of a explanation of why the gods are the way they are, right? Like why are the Olympian gods the way they are? And why are the Norse gods the way they are? Odin and Thor and all those guys. Now, if you don't really know the history of Marvel, you would look at that and say, well, it's because they're dicks. But the reality is that Odin and all his guys and Zeus and all his guys and all the various gods who kind of exist out there, the Sky Fathers, they're hands off humanity because they were instructed to do so, right? Like in the early days when Celestials showed up on Earth and they started meddling in the genes of man, gods had a constant ongoing relationship with humanity, right? That's one of the reasons why when you look at the history of Marvel, people like worshipped gods all the time, and for them, they were an absolute truth because they were at the time. The issue is that because there was so much meddling going on by the gods in the affairs of mortal men, Celestials didn't want that. And the result was that they showed up and they said, if you guys continue to meddle in the affairs of man, we'll destroy you all. And so that basically kind of created a wall between Odin and his ilk and Zeus and his ilk and all the other sky fathers that you see, which is why you don't see them acting all that often. But the overall gist here is that with Hercules getting this massive power up from Gaia, he is exceedingly powerful. Now, with him facing off against the Chaos King, one of the funny things about this is that when you look at stories like this, right, where it shows Hercules and the Chaos King fighting each other and the Earth just sitting there, a lot of times those are done as a way to kind of show us how extreme the situation is, but it's not meant to be taken literal. In this story, it is, right? Like they're literally bigger than the world and they're literally fighting outside of the Earth. It's kind of cool. But all this really sort of comes down to Amadeus Cho, right? Because with Galactus working alongside Cho, and with Cho's idea being, hey, look, there was this pocket reality that existed outside of all space and time that Hera created to lock Hercules away, the initial response of Galactus and Cho is, okay, well, we can take everybody in humanity and we can send them there. And it's kind of a cool thing because what Galactus is doing is building one of his world engines of sorts, but actually finding a way to open this portal, which he successfully does. And where the portal's open and where he tells Amadeus Cho, get all your people in there, Cho starts calculating all these possibilities and starts to realize that he can't save everyone, right? They're like, for all the people that he'll save, millions are going to die. He can't save everyone all the time. Some folks just aren't going to make it. And the inability to grasp that reality, I think, is what differentiates people who wish the world could be a certain way versus people who understand the reality of the world the way it is, right? You know, living in a realistic world versus living in a fantasy land. And so it's kind of cool because with Amadeus Cho sort of calculating all these, he's like, okay, so there's no way to save all of humanity by whisking them all to a different location. But then there is an idea that suddenly occurs to him by virtue of Hercules. And it's Hercules just saying like you can't, you know, we can't let it end this way. And that's when it dawns on Amadeus Cho, bring the Chaos King down here as fast as you can, like get him down to earth, which of course Hercules is able to do. And when that happens, you have basically the God Squad, right? So like Thor and all these different characters who all show up and they basically all start launching an attack that's not really designed to defeat the Chaos King so much as distract him and keep him slightly weakened. And what it does is it allows Hercules with the Chaos King in his weakened form to grab him and then throw him into the void, basically that place that exists outside of all space and time that Hera had created. That's where he resides, and everything just sort of devolves back down into that space. The problem with this is that where the Chaos King is technically destroyed, it's like the Langoliers from Stephen King's book, right? Like everything is pretty much consumed. There's really nothing they can do here. I mean, yeah, they saved all of creation, but there's like huge holes, huge gaping holes in the multiverse, right? I mean, like 98% of it's gone. And so it's kind of crazy here because at that point, Athena then basically approaches Hercules and says, hey, look, you can recreate everything. You can destroy everything, wipe everything out, and then let life begin again, and then basically fulfill my plan, which of course, in the eyes of Hercules is nonsense. And it's kind of intriguing here because you can make an argument on both sides, right? I mean, I could make an argument for Hercules and say, okay, so Hercules is wanting to follow the role of the traditional hero. Everybody deserves a chance to continue living on. But here's the reality. If people wanted to correct their lives, they would have done it by now. And if they don't want to, then is Athena wrong by saying the world is screwed up and corrupt? And if she's right about that, then maybe it is in the best interest of all things in reality to wipe it all out and to basically start new, right? To cleanse it all and start new. But the funny thing is that ultimately Hercules ends up coming out on top and saying, no, we are not going to do that, right? We're not going to wipe out most of this universe, right? Here's kind of a funny thing is, how did Athena come back? I don't know. But the fact remains that basically he's like, we're going to do what heroes are supposed to do, which is protect those and lead those into a better tomorrow. And so what he does is he basically disperses all this power that he has and recreates the entirety of reality, right? Like recreates the entirety of the multiverse and restores everything back to the way it was. Now, here's the problem with this, right? Here's the biggest problem with this. And this was the big problem with Marvel between 2003, 2004, running up to about 2012, right? There were a lot of events that took place where even if it wasn't on like a great big huge multiversal scale, there were a lot of events that took place whereby everything could have been destroyed, and it kind of was, and then ultimately set back to the way it was before all this kicked off in the first place. And it's kind of like, that's interesting and I get that, but the issue with stories like this is it doesn't matter, right? Like the story doesn't have any significance here, aside from maybe a couple of characters that were affected, because literally like Thor ends up going to Olympus and it's like, okay, so like I guess I'll take up residence for Zeus, and like that's basically it, right? Like the incredible Hercules story ends. There's no real impact to this, right? It's kind of like, okay, so basically there's this guy out there who's an aspect of one of the most powerful cosmic entities in existence existence, and this guy's name is the Chaos King. And the Chaos King wants to return everything to the void, and then in the process of doing it, wipes out pretty much everything that he comes across in order to achieve this goal. At the end of the day, it's all basically stopped by a young kid named Amadeus Cho, who thinks of this one scenario that basically is only really able to be maintained by the power of Hercules. And so once the Chaos King is totally destroyed, Hercules recreates everything and it goes right back to the way it was before. What's the aftermath here? What's the benefit to a story like this? And that's why I'm not necessarily against, multiverse shattering stories. I'm not necessarily against the notion of like all things are going to end and that kind of stuff, so long as it has a purpose afterwards, right? So long as I feel rewarded for having been part of it. It's kind of a cool thing. The only exception to that is if you're looking at stories, at least if I'm looking at stories like Spider-Verse, right? Because technically the whole of Spider-Verse, if you're reading Spider-Man, right? Because people ask me all the time, I want to get started with Spider-Man, where do I start? Start with Dan Slott's Spider-Man Big Time. But once you get to Superior Spider-Man, the whole entire Spider-Verse event takes place between like Superior Spider-Man issues 21 and 22. It's like that, right? I mean, it just happens, in between those two issues. But the cool thing is that what came out of it was, one, like you got to see this kind of wrapping up plot threads with like more Lun and the Inheritors and so on and so forth. And two, you could have built on top of that and come back with it later on. The Chaos King's gone. He's destroyed. He doesn't exist anymore. So there's no bringing him back, right? I mean, there's no returning that guy back here and kind of kicking it off from there. So it's kind of an interesting story, but not without its problems, not without its criticisms. But yeah, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you all hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.